you need to collect revenues domestically. Where are the taxes or the sources of revenues going to come? Often people like to emphasize the use of indirect taxes, consumption taxes in particular. The research that we've been doing show that consumption taxes are impoverishing. Okay, people say, well, but let's compensate the poor. Well, some of the research shows that you can't generate enough revenues perhaps to compensate the poor, because when you take into account the indirect effects, that may not be possible. So I invite the bank again to do careful analysis when we actually support the idea of replacing external aid by domestic resources. Who is going to be paying for those? And are we actually able to do that without generating increases in poverty or impoverishment of the poor, which are two different things, and I can go into that in my next intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And for the last overview comes from Martin Ravallion from Georgetown.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to try and steer the discussion back to the topic. This picture, one thing that we all know, we've made enormous progress against absolute poverty. You've seen many of these pictures. I'm not going to go through, and this is the one that I wanted you to look at. This is the percentage of people living below $1.25 a day back to about 1980, and you see the what I call the optimistic trajectory. It's going in the right direction, downwards. That optimistic trajectory is really essentially to continue that progress we've made. And that's important to realize. It's not like we're setting some crazy goal here. Jim Yong Kim often says the goal is to bend the curve of history. As I've told Jim at least once, no, the goal is to keep it straight, not to bend it. But actually, if I go back a little bit, back to this slide, there's another point to make here. This is taking the numbers way, way back. This is back to 1820. Now, there's huge uncertainty about these numbers, but I want to use this to make another point. We've made huge progress in reducing the percentage of people living in poverty, in absolute poverty, by a constant real poverty line over time. But in some sense, we haven't, because if you go back to 1820, you also had about 1 billion people in the world living in poverty by that standard. We had about the same number of people living in poverty then as we do now, judged against the constant real standard. The difference is, back in 1820, there were 80% of the world's population, and now it's more like it's under 20% of the world's population. We've got that percentage down enormously, but that 1 billion people, it's very sticky. So how do we actually lift that 1 billion people out of poverty, out of extreme poverty? Now, that's not going to be the end of our goals, obviously. This is just one important thing we could do. On top of that progress against poverty, we've also made a lot of progress in measuring poverty. When we started this business in the late 1980s at the bank, we were using 22 household surveys for 22 countries. That's all the data we had. That was for a background paper we did for the 1990 World Development Report. That's all the decent data we had. There's all kinds of other data. The only stuff that we thought was worth using for this purpose. It was nationally representative, decent household surveys. Now we're using 900 household surveys by a similar standard, 900 household surveys for 125 countries. There's been a huge expansion in household data over this period. But at the same time, we have enormous challenges. And actually, I worry quite a lot that we're going to backstep. We're actually making less progress in some areas than others. Those challenges, I could list a lot of them. But one of the first startling observation I can make is that we really still do not have a global microdata archive. We simply can't talk globally about poverty from a consistent, reasonably consistent set of national surveys. Those 900 surveys are just for the developing country. The bank has been doing its own thing for a long time, and I think has shown great leadership in this area. But the bank, we need it to be truly global. We have things like the Luxembourg Income Study, now called LIS, which is great for rich countries for doing poverty monitoring, but not much else. In fact, LIS has actually been rather disappointing in its coverage of emerging markets, developing countries generally. I think there's a need for the bank to reaffirm its leadership here, and I think the bank is the obvious place to do this, to assemble a truly decent global data archive. But I also think there's a lot the bank and other institutions need to do about the primary data, the data that goes into that archive. And there we have a host of problems, and there are new problems too. Across the world, we're seeing selective compliance in household surveys. It's getting harder and harder to get people to do these surveys. The surveys are getting longer and longer. But you know, people are busy. We're looking at, in Shanghai now, we're looking at non-response rates of 40% in the government's national survey. A lot of developing countries, we're looking at pretty high non-response rates. Here in the US, it's about 7%, but even that 7% can bias things like the Gini coefficient for the US by about 5 percentage points, because it's very selective compliance. It's not poor people who don't participate in surveys by and large, it's rich people, and newly rich people seem to be particularly resistant. There's a lot of challenges in the processing of the data and getting better, more comparable consumption aggregates, for example. We don't have international protocols for actually measuring consumption. We've made some progress in turning it away from income to consumption, which is a big step. We know that consumption's a better measure of welfare, and we know that it's better measured than income. But still, we have regions of the world, like Latin America, where we've made very little progress on that front, and where I think the bank should have taken more leadership in the past. A lot of other areas and a lot of other concerns include price data. You can't just look at people's consumption's incomes, you've got to allow for the prices they face. But the price data are very uneven quality over time, people playing with the methodology from one time to another in the International Comparison Project, a lot of non-comparabilities, a lot of weird things there. Again, I think a much more coordinated approach, much more consistent global perspective is needed, and I'm not seeing it at present. A number of other issues within, I could mention many of them. Macro-micro linkages are another. Across the world, we still have very weak linkage, even from the richest country to the poorest country, between the macro data and the micro data. And this is crucial if we're going to actually answer some of the key questions about how we achieve these goals. We're going to have to link macro policy through to micro poverty outcomes in a way that we've never done very well. And I think that we're doing less well over time. That leads to my final observation about the data requirements for policy analysis and evaluation in this area. In some sense, we've made progress. We've got a lot of kids all over the world doing randomized control trials, and a lot of assistant professors doing it, and lots of young people running around looking for something to randomize. And it's a great game, terrific fun, but it's not going to get us there. Most of the big questions that policymakers are asking cannot be answered that way. That's a reality. We need to rethink the way we're doing development today. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. That was a fascinating way to begin. And one of the things that we are going to look at right now is just what you were talking about, Professor Revallian, the notion that the World Bank does not have the data that would help it to make sensible decisions about what to do and where to go and what sorts of programs will work and whatnot. So if you had 2 or 3 things that you could think of that the bank ought to do in order to shape up its ability to monitor and assess its performance, what would they do?
Well, one question I have is, we've had this proliferation of initiatives on the data front in the last 10, 15 years. You know, two major initiatives going back to the back to the 1980s: the Bank and the Luxembourg Income Study. LIS for rich countries, the Bank for developing countries. We need a global picture. Poverty has now got to be looked at as a global phenomenon. First, the one thing we're going to need is a global concept of poverty. We still don't have that, but we've made advances in the literature. There are ideas out there, I think good ideas of how to do that, but implementation is a long way off. But then the question is, who's going to do who should be in charge of the data and the monitoring in this process? I still firmly believe the bank is the obvious place. Because of its geographic reach within the developing world, it's going to have to go global. It's going to have to include the rich countries as far as data compilation is concerned. But they're not contributing a lot to absolute poverty in the world. But that's another point. if we're going to take a global perspective on poverty, then we have to integrate the ideas of absolute and relative poverty in much more convincing ways. I firmly believe that we should not judge somebody, we should judge somebody to be not poor if they are neither absolutely poor by this $1.25 a day standard, or not relatively poor by the standards typical of the country they live in. Both those concepts have to be brought together. Again, I think the bank's the obvious place to do that. But when I look at what's happening in the bank, I see a lot of proliferation. It's a lot of cowboys out there in doing their own thing in different regions. I'm not seeing the kind of coordination we need within the institution to really do justice to the capability of the institution in this area. And that capability is unequaled. There is nowhere in the world that has the capability of the World Bank in poverty data, in collecting data, things like the LSMS, the Living Standards Measurement Study back to the 1980s, initiatives since then. The leadership and the technical capability of the bank is unequaled in this respect. But we really do need leadership on the coordination, the consistency, establishing protocols, establishing comparability. The cowboys regime, where every country and every region of the bank is doing its own thing, justified, it seems, by the client interests, that is going to have to be compromised to some extent in the name of a global effort, global success.
Professor Listic, we have some suggestions on monitoring and assessing. Would you want to take on the question of trying to share prosperity?
Yeah, actually, I also wanted to make a few comments on the data, if I may.
Okay.
I think that Martin is absolutely right. The production of data is a public good, and because it is a public good, it will be probably subject to underinvestment. And World Bank, as a global public institution, is very well positioned to fill that gap. And I totally agree with Martin that one of the problems has been primarily coordination, because there is problems in the quantity, the quality, the comprehensiveness, the accessibility, and also the ability of the bank to strengthen local capacity so the countries become independent eventually in terms of how they produce high-quality data. So I think that that's going to be crucial if we want to actually have good monitoring. On the data front, and also in order to measure what I said earlier, which I don't know why Martin said it was off topic, because I think one of the things that the World Bank needs to be sure of is that it's not contributing to increasing poverty, because otherwise, it would be going against its own goals. And so for monitoring that, I think that it might be very important to do this, particularly what the bank calls the public expenditure reviews, much more in detail, which is now something that I know the anchor here's Christina, who's heading one of these initiatives at the bank, which is looking at not just what happens with the more aggregate and broad categories of spending and revenue collecting, but also to do some incidence analysis in terms of knowing who pays and who receives benefits from the public sector, because that would allow you to see, first, when we have discussions of if you remove subsidies, who's going to be hurt, if you need to increase taxes, who's going to pay them, if you want to add transfers so to compensate the poor, who you need to compensate, where are they? So that kind of analysis is not systematically done. And a lot of the policy recommendations of the bank have that component. If we don't have that disaggregation in terms of having, either standard fiscal incident analysis, sophisticated incidence analysis with behavioral responses, general equilibrium effect, what have you, as part of your public expenditure analysis, it's going to be very hard to see what is the bank doing in terms of helping at least to have the right type of information for the recommendations that come with the policy package. I think that applies to the bottom 40%, to the poverty measures, to the inequality measures. And another thing that Martin didn't mention this, but I'm sure he will agree, we probably also want to have some more panel data. Because when we talk about the bottom 40%, it's very different if we're looking at people that, one of the questions is always the same people who are in the bottom 40%? Are they dynasties, or are they the same type of individuals but different people? Is the bottom 40% primarily people who are unemployed or who are disabled or sick or orphans or whatever? Or are they dynasties that get stuck in chronic poverty? And the type of policies that would trigger whether one or the other would be different. And you need panel data in order to be able to answer that. So not only household surveys of the cross-section type, but panel data, and you have worked a lot on this, so you can complement what I'm saying, is going to be very useful.
Now, I hope that we can't really get into a discussion about how to rework the World Bank so that it will provide all of the information to programmers that undoubtedly exists in the archives and the research facilities that this bank has. But I'm fascinated to hear that just sort of the kinds of things that you all think ought to be included in any program of this sort. I have no idea, and I dare say there aren't too many people in this room who could take on the idea of remodeling the World Bank so that it would provide all the possibilities. But would either of you like to add anything to the question of monitoring and assessing? And
yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Durko.
No, thank you very much. Yes, I want to comment essentially on these data points and also make a few comments on what Martin has been saying, because I thought we shouldn't just let him get away with it. So first so this whole idea on data and there's been events also in the last few days on things like data revolution, and as a humble civil servant being asked to do a revolution, it's always quite an interesting experience to do so, and it's and I do think there's certain things we can do, and I think what Martin said, and actually Noor has commented on as well, is this urgent need for some forms of global standards, global norms and standards. We're wasting a lot of effort in data collection by just fundamentally thinking we're always more clever than anyone else and making a slight changes so nothing is comparable, we can never integrate it, and so on. So there's a lot of cowboys around, and they're not just people who do randomized controlled trials, but also a lot of people who do surveys, keep on tweaking and twisting and turning and so on. And as a result, we collect so much data that would be useful, but in the end, we can't compare. For example, I don't think as a researcher I can write the economic history of Africa since about 1980. I think beforehand it would probably be easier because the data were quite comparable, and then we started every year and every couple of years changing everything, and we can't even say anything about our main things in an African context. So that's important. So global norms and standards, that's a global public good. World Bank should work together also with other stakeholders, international statistical officers, Paris 21, all these kind of groups. There's a huge amount of work to be done, and if everybody would be less obsessed with saying I'm right, but actually working a bit more together, we could get quite far. But there's a second part on the data stuff that actually worries me quite a bit. We're not going to get necessarily better policy simply because we have better data. There's plenty of data around to actually do policy with quite all right, and we don't use it. And if there's something to do with the data revolution, we'll have to work much harder at incentivizing, including people within the bank, to always use all the data that they have to actually use it properly. And that's comes back to points I made earlier. It's about when we do ex-ante design, decision making, that we use all the data we have and we don't ignore certain bits and pieces because they don't fit our thing. And the same in accountability, that we really dig deep in it. Because fundamentally, I'm afraid actually, and this is where I a little bit disagree with Martin, is that actually data alone are not going to deliver much of any of these changes. All the progress in poverty, the halving of poverty, in that picture that we have up there between 1800 and 1940, halving of world poverty was achieved without any data. You don't need necessarily data for good policy, but it helps. And so we have to think a little bit further about it. And I want to make a final point. It's not just, again, learning about the past patterns and the linear line going down, and just, as Martin likes to say, you have to keep on staying on the curve. We have to realize what staying on the curve in poverty reduction will have to mean. We can't go to negative poverty in China up to about 2000, all poverty reduction, the slope of the curve was delivered by China. We can't go to a negative slope. We have subsequently have some curvature in it there. We have basically India coming into the picture. We're going to, if we want to go to 3%, we'll have to go and deal with really messy places. It's not about data that will necessarily change it. It's also thinking carefully about what we do in these places before we can actually get ever to these 3%. Thank you.
Now, what do you think, Arsenio? What do you think about the notion that that extreme poverty, boosting shared prosperity, those kinds of things? Would that, I mean, does something like that make any sense in the Philippines and in your own politics?
Yeah, poverty reduction is and inequality is a very burning issue in my country and in my region of that part of the world. Just to give you the point, in the Philippines, while economic growth has been quite respectable in recent years, what is puzzling is that the response of poverty, given the data that's available, to that growth has been quite muted compared to what we see internationally, and so there's a strong clamor actually for doing something about it. In fact, the fear that we have is that if we are not able to address that issue and show proof, the evidence that indeed the growth is benefiting the poor, as particularly the bottom 30 or 40%, the sustainability of the growth could be actually undermined. And so the focus of our recent efforts is to bring that poverty into the picture, and there's a lot of interest in it. The media is closely watching the data that we come out. The problem, though, is, and I think I would like to comment on that issue on the data, is that in a developing country like the Philippines, data generation often is the least of priority because it doesn't usually deliver the bucks that politicians would want, and so you're working with very outdated data, unrepresentative data, particularly if you are working on poverty reduction, where you would like to have as detailed data at the local level as possible, but the data we have don't allow you to make a representation of the population in that in those local units, and so while we try to address the poverty and you try to get local governments to come in, other partners to come in, you're really so blind. In fact, I have been challenging my colleagues in the bank actually to look closely at the data. What's the problem in the data in the Philippines? Because for the last almost 10 years now, poverty incidence has remained flat, whereas economic growth has been quite respectable. The country in recent years has been growing at an average of 6% for the last 3 years, 7.2% last year. We're expected to grow at 6.5% to 7.5% this year, and people don't see that poverty. So there's a really strong demand in the public to generate that information. And by the way, while we are looking at poverty here in the sense of income, I think we need to bring in also the concern that poverty is more than just income, and the other dimensions are equally important. That's quite interesting, because if I look at the different other dimensions of poverty, not in terms of access to education, to health, being able to read, being able to write, being able to practice express your voice. All these are very much income elastic, meaning they show that these indicators of welfare tend to respond well to growth. Whereas when I look at the income poverty, they don't show me that there is such a progress. So I think that points to us that our menu of data should go beyond just income indicators, because we do the information there is much more nuanced than what we I think we see in the income indicators of poverty.
But do you think in your part of the world that the powerful people, the ones who have benefited from the economic growth, are equally interested in sharing?
Well, they do. At least I'm talking about the Philippines and some of the developing countries in our region that I am familiar with. There is such, even for the high income groups, they do see the benefits of addressing the concerns of the poorest members of society. Experience does show that when there is conflict, ethnic conflict, or arising to inequities, or even peace and order problems like politically motivated peace and order problems, they affect the ability of the country to move on to a higher growth path, and since high growth obviously benefits the upper income groups, when that growth path is reduced because of your failure to address inequities, that they see as a potential loss, and so they actually support measures to reduce that poverty. Of course, don't tell them that they have to pay in terms of higher taxes, because there's no such thing as free lunch, right? But the point that I want to make here is that the need for good data, and I think that the need for more frequent, timely, comprehensive data, comprehensive in the sense that it's useful for policymakers, for program administrators who are interested in targeting the poor, reaching the poor, providing basic services. I think this is what the World Bank, I think, can invest on. Because as I said, data are public goods, and I think that if you can do this for the least developed countries and focus the data generation in these countries, we should be able to advance the poverty reduction goal. The other more advanced middle-income countries like China, Indonesia, they are now more able to support their own data generation. The current account surplus there is even my country. We are a low middle-income country, but the current account surplus has been positive for the last 10 years. We could, but the problem is, as I said, the data generation is often not the priority of the local politicians, and that's where we need to exert a lot of effort in perhaps leveraging the resources of the bank to get this data.
Mr. Durkan, could I just ask you to speak? I mean, you did part of this already, but the question of attribution is part of this program, and the question of whether institutions like the sort of institutional programs that you manage, that you are creating and helping to fund, whether you would adopt these goals, whether you would consider moving on a sort of united front in terms of what the World Bank is trying to do?
Okay, well, I probably should start, and I was actually asking one of my colleagues, Idifi, this morning, if I'm being asked whether we would adopt goals like this, how should I reply? And my colleague said, she looked rather bemused and said, well, we did about 15 years ago, and the bank is just catching up with it. By law, the DFID has to focus on reducing poverty. It is by law, it's enshrined that any spending we has to be judged against our contribution